lesson, we're going to talk about epistemology, logic, and fallacies, which means that we're going to learn about the rules for thinking, how to think validly. And we're going to see that if you don't think validly, you end up with errors. That's pretty obvious. So let's begin this lesson. Let's start by looking at the science of epistemology, which is a branch of philosophy. And although we would say that metaphysics is, the most fundamental branch of science within philosophy, well, epistemology is, I think, just as important, mainly because it's all about whether we can know anything at all. So we better get that straight before we study further. So epistemology is a study of knowledge itself. And it's really the only science that studies this, because everything else studies knowledge, right? Different kinds of knowledge, but things that you know about. Whereas here, what we're doing is we're studying knowledge itself, just the very act of knowing and what that really means. All right, so what is logical truth? This is a question we're going to answer today. Logical truth is the conformity of mind to reality, right? If I hold up my hand and say my hand has 5 fingers, well, then what's in my mind matches what's reality because that's true. Ontological truth is one of the transcendentals, and we learned that in last week's lesson. It's one of the transcendentals, the intrinsic knowability of a thing. The more essay it has, the more knowable it is. But we're looking in this lesson at logical truth. Can logical truth be known at all? So holding up the hand with 5 fingers again, right? Can I really know that there are 5 fingers? How do I know that I can know that? That's the kind of question. Can I know it for sure, or is it doubtful? Could someone disagree with me? These questions then are, you look at them and you say, well, those are silly questions. The reason we say they're silly is because we take them for granted. We don't think about these questions, we just proceed through our day. But if you can't answer these questions, and if you think about it, all science is a waste of time. All learning is a waste of time. And that's why we need to get these things straight. Logical truth is the conformity between mind and reality. And I don't know why the G and the I got cut off there in the word logical. But right now it looks like local. But logical truth is the conformity between mind and reality. The human mind knows 3 self-evident truths. Such truths cannot be demonstrated since they are the principles of every demonstration. They can be affirmed by showing the absurdity of their contradiction. These truths, so fundamental that all subsequent affirmations depend on them, are the following. All right, so before I go into that a little bit more, I want to explain what this means, that we affirm them by showing their absurdity. Well, we can't prove them because they're so foundational. And in this lesson, we'll learn why there has to be something that you can't prove. But you can show the absurdity. So, like, let's say something as silly as the hand again, right? And I say, or someone says, well, that hand doesn't exist. I mean, I can't prove that it exists. I also can't disprove that it exists. It just exists. But I can show the absurdity of denying its existence by just slapping my face. Slapping my face. And maybe I slap my face really, really hard. I think after a while, I'm going to realize how silly it is to say that my hand doesn't exist, because my face will be all black and blue with bruises. All right, you get the picture. So the first one is that I know being, or ente in Latin. Before I know anything else, I know that this thing here in front of me, the chair, the book, particular object, the hand, exists. And the reductio ad absurdum, or the reducing something to the absurd, is that the judging consciousness is undeniable, right? It brings me face to face with things that are perceived as being outside of me. Calling this illusion is absurd. So, the hand is something, or the teddy bear, the teddy bear is outside of me. But calling it an illusion is absurd because, if I hit myself with a teddy bear, it doesn't hurt much, but I can certainly feel it. And it's just silly to deny it. Oh, there's the GI. That's weird. The GI came at the end, in the top left corner. Local became logical. All right. I also know non-being and the principle of non-contradiction. When I know that this thing here in front of me exists, I know that its non-existence is diametrically opposed to its existence. In other words, to be is the opposite of not to be, and something cannot both be and not be at the same time, in the same place, in the same respect. That is the principle of non-contradiction. Some people say, well, that's the foundation of all knowledge. It's not quite true. There's something even deeper than that foundation of all knowledge, which is that things exist in the first place. All right, but following closely on the heels of something existing is its non-existence. And that's why this is non-provable fact number 2. And finally, I know that I exist. When I experience this thing here in front of me as something that exists, so the teddy bear, I know that the existence of this thing is not the same as my own existence. I know that I am not the teddy bear, right? It's outside of me. And because I experience things that are outside of me, I become aware of me that's separate from all other things. Now, this is something we don't think about, like I said earlier. We just take these things for granted. It's how we live every second of our lives. And these are some sources here. These 3 truths, which I know instinctively without thinking of them explicitly, are then summarized in a single act of reflection upon my own thoughts, an act known as the complete reflection, or reductio completa. In this single act, I simultaneously and explicitly know 3 things. A, this thing here in front of me. B, my own act of knowing it. And C, myself as the one who knows it. So this is where self-awareness comes in. I know myself, I know my own act of knowledge, right? This is something that only spiritual beings can do. Animals can't reflect upon themselves, but a spiritual being can. We do this through the reductio completa. From the above paragraphs, we can see that the human mind first knows 3 fundamental truths implicitly. The 3 that I mentioned, right? Being, non-being / principle of non-contradiction, and my own existence. And then, through the reductio completa, the same mind explicitly knows that it knows these truths. To know that you know. Once it has reached this point, the mind can confidently affirm other truths, all of which are ultimately based on the first 3. And if you look at the first 3, the most radical of those is number 1, which is that things exist. That's a fact. But we can't prove it. Of course you can't prove it. It's just a fact that you use to prove everything else. Now there has to be at least one unprovable fact. Okay, this is where we bring into mind something that we talked about last week. And it was that really brief article we read about an infinite regress. An infinite regress is impossible. Now, this is true in series of causes and effects, but it's also true in series of things that can be proven. You see, if I say, all right, everything I know has to be proven, and I proceed mathematically with things, right? And that sounds like a logical way to proceed. It sounds like a noble pursuit. And certainly, we can prove so many things in math and science. We can prove so many things. But when we prove something, we always have to prove it with a premise, something earlier, on which the conclusion depends. But then that thing, right, is a conclusion of a premise, which is itself a conclusion of a premise, etc., etc., etc. But notice that we can't go back forever. We can't have an infinite regression of provable things. Ultimately, there has to be at least one thing that cannot be proven, because it's so fundamental that everything else is proven from it. 2 plus 2 equals 4, that's right. But what meaning do numbers have unless we can actually count? If we couldn't count to 2 and to 4 and to 6, then those would have no meaning. If we don't experience the number 2 or the number 3, then the abstraction of that, the abstract numbers, mean nothing. And then we get back to unprovable stuff. Okay, the number 2. Where are you getting the number 2 from? Well, from 2 fingers. 2 plus 2 is 4. Okay. But 2 fingers, then the 2 fingers exist. Yeah. Oh, now prove that. No, you can't. You can't. That's the whole point. Because there has to be at least one unprovable thing. Otherwise, you have infinite regress problems. All right, so that was a brief introduction to epistemology, and many would say that doesn't do it justice, and it probably doesn't. But as I've said before, it's better to have some introduction to it than nothing at all. All right, now let's talk about logic. Logic is reasoning conducted or assessed according to strict principles of validity, a particular system or codification of the principles of proof and inference. Okay, so this is the formal definition of logic, and we're going to see this. We're going to see this in action in one of the articles that we'll read. Okay, but I'll get to that in a second. Closely related to logic is the concept of fallacy, because if logic, as we saw here, is reasoning conducted or assessed according to strict principles of validity, well, then fallacy is really the opposite of that. It's just arguments that don't work because they fail in logic. Fallacies are defects that weaken arguments. Fallacious arguments are very, very common and can be quite persuasive, at least to the casual reader or listener. You can find dozens of examples of fallacious reasoning in newspapers and advertisements. I'm sure you guys have seen that many times. You can find them in debates, right? Political debates, conversations with friends, commercials, all kinds of fallacies we're constantly exposed to. Things that sound good on the surface, but when you go deeper, they just don't work. So in this lesson, we're going to learn how to recognize some of those at least. It is sometimes hard to evaluate whether an argument is fallacious. An argument might be sound or unsound, valid or invalid. And we want to clarify these terms, and so to do it, I'd like you to do the assignment for this lesson. Read and summarize truth, validity, and soundness for homework. There's a link in the description of the YouTube video, and you can click on it and read, and you should read. It's got some basic building blocks of logic that you'll need to know before we go further. So read and take notes on that, and we'll pause the video, obviously, and then come back after you've done that assignment. The following fallacies that we're about to go through, it's like, I think 19 of them, are from A Concise Introduction to Logic by Patrick Hurley and the UNC Chapel Hill Writing Center. I put a link there too for your reference. All right, so the first fallacy is hasty generalization. The definition is making assumptions about a whole group or range of cases based on a sample that is inadequate, usually because it is atypical or just too small. All right, so here we get stereotypes, right? Frat boys are drunkards, grad students are nerdy, etc. Or a common example, the principle underlying hasty generalization. It's when you jump to conclusions when you don't have enough facts. My roommate said her philosophy class was hard, and the one I'm in is hard too. All philosophy classes must be hard. Now, the conclusion may or may not be true, all right? But you can't prove it by just something your roommate said. The sample size is too small, so this would be hasty generalization. Two people's experiences are, in this case, not enough on which to base a conclusion. And in this case, it's really only one person's experience, the roommate who's taking the class. And, well, actually, that's not true. There are two people because they're both taking it. But still, two is not enough, even three or four. You just can't base your conclusion on that. Missing the point. The definition is the premises of an argument do support a particular conclusion, but not the conclusion that the arguer actually draws. So this example, the seriousness of a punishment should match the seriousness of the crime. Right now, the punishment for drunk driving may simply be a fine. But drunk driving is a very serious crime that can kill innocent people, so the death penalty should be the punishment for drunk driving. That is harsh. and that's ludicrous because it misses the point. The conclusion is not supported by the true premises. The argument actually supports several conclusions. Punishment for drunk driving should be very serious, but it doesn't support the claim that the death penalty specifically is warranted. Let's look at some other examples. There are many angry riots occurring in the streets. Something must be done to protect the safety of innocent bystanders. Therefore, we must start arresting people that gather in groups larger than 5. It's silly, right? It just doesn't follow, even though the first two things are true. We are quickly diminishing the supplies of fossil fuels in the earth. We must do our part to conserve resources. Both of those are true. Therefore, we must abandon cars and electricity and adopt the ways of the Amish. I mean, that'll work, right? that will work. But the two premises, the two true premises, don't necessarily support that conclusion. The forest fire is burning faster than we can contain it. Fighting forest fires is a drain on the state's resources. Therefore, we should just let the whole forest burn. Okay, that'll work too, right? But that's pretty silly. All right, post hoc, or false cause. This fallacy gets its name from the Latin phrase post hoc, ergo propter hoc, which translates as after this, therefore because of this. So you assuming that because B comes after A caused B. We can't just assume that chronological order indicates causality. Of course, sometimes one event really does cause another one that comes later. For example, if I register for a class, my name later appears on the roll, it's true that the first event caused the one that came later. Sometimes two events that seem related in time aren't really related as cause and event. Correlation isn't the same as causation. So here's this example. President Jones raised taxes and the rate of violent crime went up. Jones is responsible for the rise in crime. Now, he may be responsible for the rise in crime. This may be true, but we can't just say it because it happened after. The increase in taxes might or might not be one factor in the rising crime rates, but the argument hasn't shown us that one caused the other. All right, so for the remaining fallacies in this lesson, each time we cover one, I'd like you to pause the video, just think of your own random example, and then resume. The reason we're going to do this is because thinking of examples for things helps us to learn it better. All right, to start with this one, pause, think of your own. It can be anything. Just make sure it fits the description of post hoc, and then resume. All right, weak analogy. Definition: many arguments rely on an analogy between two or more objects, ideas, or situations. If the two things that are being compared aren't really alike in the relevant respects, the analogy is a weak one, and the argument that relies on it commits the fallacy of weak analogy. So here's this example. Guns are like hammers. They're both tools with metal parts that could be used to kill someone. And yet it would be ridiculous to restrict the purchase of hammers, so restrictions on purchasing guns are equally ridiculous. This is a classic weak analogy. While guns and hammers do share certain features, these features, having metal parts, being tools, and being potentially useful for violence, are not the ones at stake in deciding whether to restrict guns. Rather, we restrict guns because they can easily be used to kill large numbers of people at a distance. This is a feature hammers do not share. It'd be hard to kill a crowd with a hammer. Thus, and the analogy is weak, and so is the argument based on it. And even here, right, we can't commit the fallacy of missing the point and say, oh yeah, gun control. Okay, so then no one's allowed to have a gun. No, that's missing the point, right? We can still have our Second Amendment rights. But the reason this is a weak analogy is because guns and hammers, they do have some things in common, but not enough to justify what we're saying here. Okay, so this would be an extreme example, but with weak analogy, you're finding the similarities between two things, and you can really find that with anything. You know, the teddy bear and I mean, there's really not that much we have in common, but if I want to push weak analogy, I can say, well, we both have heads, we both have eyes, and we both have 4 limbs, therefore we are both intelligent beings. Okay, silly. That's an example of weak analogy. If you think about it, you can make an analogy of some kind between almost any two things in the world. This dry sponge is like a mud puddle because they both get bigger when it rains and they're both kind of murky. And so you can see how ridiculous that is. All right, so pause the video, think of your own example, and then resume. Appeal to authority. Often we add strength to our arguments by referring to respected sources or authorities and explaining their positions on the issues we're discussing. If, however, we try to get readers to agree with us simply by impressing them with a famous name or by appealing to a supposed authority who really isn't much of an expert, we commit the fallacy of appeal to authority. You'll see this. This is kind of common in advertisements or commercials, right? Some famous person is promoting something that has nothing to do with their area of expertise. We're supposed to buy it because of that? Well, that's classic appeal to authority. We should abolish the death penalty. Many respected people, such as actor Chris Pratt, have publicly stated their opposition to it. While Chris Pratt may be an authority on matters having to do with acting, there's no particular reason why anyone should be moved by his political opinions. By the way, I don't know if he has that opinion or not. I just took a name of someone famous. He may or may not have that opinion. He is probably no more of an authority on the death penalty than the person writing the paper, because that's not his job, right? He's an actor. He's not a politician or a judge or a legislator. All right, so this is a pretty easy one to think of an example for, but yeah, pause, think of an example, and then resume. Appeal to pity. The appeal to pity takes place when an arguer tries to get people to accept a conclusion by making them feel sorry for someone. This is really easy to spot. I know the exam is graded based on performance, but you should give me an A. My cat has been sick. My car broke down. I've had a cold, so it was really hard for me to study. And I, as a teacher, have heard this kind of fallacy a bunch of times when justifying missing work or a missed test. The conclusion here is you should give me an A, but the criteria for getting an A have to do with learning and applying the material from the course. The principle the arguer wants us to accept, people who have a hard week deserve A's, is clearly unacceptable. All right, so as I said, easy to recognize, right? It's wrong to tax corporations. Think of all the money they give to charity and the cost they already pay to run their businesses. So are we supposed to feel sorry for them? Well, I guess that's the idea here, but it's a fallacious argument. All right, so pause the video, think of an appeal to pity example, and resume when you're done. Appeal to ignorance. In the appeal to ignorance, the arguer basically says, look, there's no conclusive evidence on the issue at hand, therefore you should accept my conclusion on this issue. This is a really common one as well. People have been trying for centuries to prove that God exists, but no one has yet been able to prove it, therefore God does not exist. That's appeal to ignorance, right? Just because no one's been able to do it yet doesn't mean anything. No one was able to understand that time is relative before Einstein came along, but then he came along and now everyone understands it. So The fact that in the centuries, the millennia before Einstein, no one thought of that concept, and then set out to prove it, well, that doesn't mean anything. Here's an opposing argument. People have been trying for years to prove that God does not exist, but no one has yet been able to prove it, therefore God exists. See, you may or may not agree with the conclusion, but that's not a good argument for it. A lack of knowledge. In each case, the arguer tries to use a lack of evidence as support for a positive claim about the truth of a conclusion. There is one situation in which doing this is not fallacious. If qualified researchers have used well thought out methods to search for something for a long time, they haven't found it, and it's the kind of thing people ought to be able to find, then the fact that they haven't found it constitutes some evidence that it doesn't exist. So, I don't know, could Yeti or Sasquatch, Bigfoot be an example of that? Possibly. Loch Ness Monster? Possibly. But that's, people actually going out and seeking the evidence that can be found, and haven't found it. That's different. With appeal to ignorance, you're just talking about stuff, knowledge that people lack, especially when it's knowledge that they probably can't acquire. All right, so as usual, pause, think of an example, and then resume. Ad hominem, easy to recognize. In this fallacy, the arguer basically says, look, this guy is a jerk. Therefore, you shouldn't believe anything he says. Example, poet Allen Ginsberg has argued in favor of abolishing censorship of pornographic literature. But Ginsberg's arguments are nothing but trash. Ginsberg, is a marijuana-smoking homosexual and a thoroughgoing advocate of the drug culture. So all you're doing here is you're just attacking the person. It doesn't work. Or William Buckley has argued in favor of legalizing drugs such as cocaine and heroin, but Buckley is just another one of those upper-crust intellectuals who is out of touch with real America. No sensible person should listen to his pseudo-solutions. Now, Ginsberg and Buckley might be wrong, right? But we should prove they're wrong by looking at their arguments and not by pointing fingers at the person. All right, so pause, think of an example, and then resume. Straw man, extremely common, and we'll see this in some political debates. One way of making our own argument stronger is to anticipate and respond in advance to the arguments that an opponent might make. The arguer sets up a wimpy version of the opponent's position and tries to score a point by knocking it down. That's where the name of the fallacy comes from, because the wimpy version of the opponent's position, right, the misrepresentation of that position, is the straw man that you can knock down. Example, feminists want to ban all pornography and punish everyone who looks at it. But such harsh measures are surely inappropriate, so the feminists are wrong. Porn and its readers should be left in peace. The feminist argument is made weak by being overstated. In fact, most feminists do not propose an outright ban on porn or any punishment for those who merely look at it. Often they propose some restrictions on things like child porn, or propose to allow people who are hurt by porn to sue publishers and producers, not readers, for damages. Okay, so whether you agree with the conclusion or not, we got to look at what's going on here. What they've done is they set up a straw man and knocked it down, and that's fallacious. Another example, Mr. Goldberg has argued against prayer in the public schools. Obviously, Mr. Goldberg advocates atheism, but atheism is what they used to have in the Soviet Union. Atheism leads to the suppression of all religions and the replacement of God by an omnipotent state. Is that what we want for this country? No way. Mr. Goldberg's argument is useless. So you can see it's a straw man being that he advocates atheism, which he doesn't. He advocates against prayer in the public schools. All right, so as usual, pause, think of your own straw man, and resume. Red herring. Partway through an argument, the arguer goes off on a tangent, raising a side issue that distracts the audience from what's really at stake. Often the arguer never returns to the original issue. And it's called this because this was an old training technique for hunting dogs. If you wanted the hunting dog to follow a scent, specifically of the animal that you just killed, the pheasant you shot out of the sky, you'd have a red herring nearby that smelled strong, so that the dog would learn to ignore the distracting smells and go after the real thing, which was the prey, the killed animal. So here's an example. Grading this example on a curve would be the most fair thing to do. After all, classes go more smoothly when the students and the professor are getting along well. Let's try our premise conclusion outlining to see what's wrong with this argument. Premise: classes go more smoothly when the students and the professor are getting along well. Conclusion: grading this exam on a curve would be the most fair thing to do. How is that a red herring? When we lay it out this way, it's pretty obvious that the arguer went off on a tangent. The fact that something helps people get along doesn't necessarily make it more fair. Fairness and justice sometimes require us to do things that cause conflict. And, conversely, doing the nice thing for someone, right, such as letting them get off scot-free and unpunished, doesn't always form character. And so this is a red herring here, because basically the premise is a distraction that sounds good. The audience may feel like the issue of teachers and students agreeing is important and be distracted from the fact that the arguer is not given any evidence as to why a curve would be fair. And so the arguer, using this fallacious argument, takes advantage of that distraction to push forward a conclusion that doesn't follow. Margie says that Taster's Choice coffee tastes better than Folgers. Apparently she's ignoring the fact that Taster's Choice is made by Nestle. And Nestle is the company that manufactured that terrible baby formula for third world countries. Thousands of babies died when the dry milk formula was mixed with contaminated water. Clearly Margie is wrong. Okay, so this is a big red herring. And in fact, we can see that this fails on a couple levels, right? One way it fails is that the taste of coffee has nothing to do with some kind of milk formula they made years ago. But the other thing, too, is that we really can't even blame the milk formula. We really have to blame the contaminated water. Now, maybe they should have been clear in their instructions, and maybe they should have been clear in saying what kind of water needed to be mixed with it. I don't know. But this argument is not only a red herring, but it just doesn't add up. It defeats common sense. All right, so pause, think of your own red herring, and then resume. False dichotomy. In false dichotomy, the arguer sets up the situation so it looks like there are only two choices. The arguer then eliminates one of the choices, so it seems that we are left with only one option, the one the arguer wanted us to pick in the first place. All right, so let's look at an example. Caldwell Hall is in bad shape. Either we tear it down and put up a new building, or we continue to risk students' safety. Obviously, we shouldn't risk anyone's safety, so we must tear the building down. Okay, so it's saying that you have only two options: tear it down or leave it standing. But that's false, because there are actually more than two options. The argument neglects to mention the possibility that we might repair the building or find some way to protect students from the risks in question. For example, if only a few rooms are in bad shape, perhaps we shouldn't hold classes in those rooms. Right? It's not just an either-or thing. All right, so pause the video, think of your false dichotomy example, and then resume. Begging the question. An argument that begs the question asks the reader to simply accept the conclusion without providing real evidence. The argument either relies on a premise that says the same thing as the conclusion, which you might here refer to as being circular or circular reasoning, or simply ignores an important but questionable assumption that the argument rests on. Now, there's a common misuse of the English language that has to do with this fallacy. And this is so common. I see it at least a few times a year. I'll see it in articles. I just saw it the other day in an online blog post by a supposedly good writer who, used flowery language and had good grammar and sounded like a good writer, but even that person used this wrong. Basically, sometimes you'll see this used as a way to say raise the question, right? So I go into my house and I see muddy footprints on the carpet, And that begs the question, who tracked mud in? Well, no, that's the wrong way to say begs the question. What you should do is say, oh, and that raises the question. All right, so just in your own writing and speaking and thinking, don't make that mistake. All right, so sometimes people use the phrase beg the question as a sort of general criticism arguments to mean that arguer hasn't given very good reasons for a conclusion. That's not the meaning we're going to discuss here. Okay, so I already talked about the linguistic abuse of beg the question instead of raise the question. There's also the logical abuse of beg the question, which is basically means you didn't answer the question or that argument doesn't work, but that's also imprecise. But here's an example of what begging the question really is. Active euthanasia is morally acceptable. It is a decent, ethical thing to help another human being escape suffering through death. Let's lay this out in premise-conclusion form. The premise is it is a decent, ethical thing to help another human being escape suffering through death. The conclusion is that active euthanasia is morally acceptable. Notice that it's just the same thing. If we translate the premise, we'll see that the arguer has really just said the same thing twice. Decent, ethical means pretty much the same as morally acceptable, and help another human being escape suffering through death means active euthanasia. So we haven't proven anything. We've simply begged the question by restating it. It's talking in circles. It's circular reasoning. You can't prove or use the premise to prove the conclusion and the conclusion to prove the premise when they're just the same thing. So the premise basically says active euthanasia is morally acceptable, just like the conclusion does. The arguer hasn't yet given us any real reasons why euthanasia is acceptable. Instead, she's left us asking, well, really, why do you think active euthanasia is acceptable? Her argument begs, that is, evades the real question. So the real meaning of beg here in the logical fallacy is avoid or evade. It's not ask for or beg for in supplication. No, that's not the meaning. All right, pause, think of your own begging the question, example, and resume. Complex question. A single question that includes two separate but related questions, forcing the opponent to answer both questions at once. This is sometimes called loaded question. Examples. Have you stopped cheating on your exams? Well, think about this. How is this a loaded question? Because you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, right? You say yes, you say no, you incriminate yourself. Where did you hide the cookies you stole? If I say I don't know, it means I stole the cookies. So you're basically just accusing me of stealing cookies with the question. An answer of yes or no or nowhere to either will incriminate the responder. All right, so these are fun to think of examples for. Pause, think of example, and resume. Equivocation. Equivocation is sliding between two or more different meanings of a single word or phrase that is important to the argument. It's basically just using wordplay as a trick. Giving money to charity is the right thing to do, so charities have a right to our money. Well, not exactly. The equivocation here is on the word right. Right can mean both something that is correct or good, as in I got the right answers on the test, and something to which someone has a claim, as in everyone has a right to life. Okay, we see it's the same word, spelled the same way, sounds the same, right, R-I-G-H-T, but means very different things. Sometimes an arguer will deliberately, sneakily equivocate, often on words like freedom, justice, rights, and so forth. Other times the equivocation is a mistake or misunderstanding. Either way, it's important that you use the main terms of your argument consistently. All right, so think of an example of equivocation, especially words that are the same or at least sound the same, that have different meanings, and come up with funny equivocation arguments, or at least one, and then resume the video. Motte and Bailey. All right, this is from a type of castle, the Motte and Bailey Castle. You can see this here on the right. You've got the very well protected keep or place, probably a place where the king lives, where valuables are kept up here on the hill, and then you have the less defensible Bailey. That's quite a bit easier to attack, where the villagers live. And so this fallacy has something to do with the setup of the castle. The fallacy conflates two positions, one that is easy to defend and universally accepted, and the other that is controversial and difficult to defend, with the objective of winning support for the controversial position. Okay, so let's look at an example. We should be compassionate towards homosexuals and transgender people. Anyone who disapproves of homosexuality and transgenderism is a bigot and a hater. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Although you probably know that this is kind of a common argument. It's just Mott and Bailey. The Mott is the first statement which all can accept, right? We should be compassionate. The Bailey is the second statement which simply isn't true, because it's impossible to treat a person with kindness and respect even when you don't approve of their lifestyle. Sorry, it is possible. It's possible and necessary. Hate the sin, love the sinner, right? We do this all the time in Christian life. We can't agree with everyone. We have to accept or respect them. We don't have to embrace their ideas, but we still have to recognize that they're a person. Okay, but see, that principle can be taken too far and indicate that we have to agree with people and prop up their erroneous opinions, and this is not true. In this case, the Bailey appears to be somewhat validated by the Mott. That's why this fallacy is so widespread and insidious. Okay, so even though the Bailey is not, it's not as strong as the Mott, it seems to be, right? It sounds good. It sounds like the nice way to be. Or it sounds like we're disapproving of people who are mean. But see, I hope you can recognize that it's just not a logical way of proceeding. All right, so pause, think of your own Mott and Bailey, and resume. No true Scotsman, also called appeal to purity. This fallacy attempts to invalidate a contrary claim by showing that the holder of the claim is not authentic, not the real deal, right? All right, so here's an example. Angus says that Scotsmen avoid wearing pink shirts. Lachlan walks in wearing a pink shirt and announces, "I'm secure in my masculinity. I'm a proud Scotsman, and I have no problem wearing pink." Angus shouts angrily, "He is not a true Scotsman." Terrible Scottish accent, but you know what I mean. What matters here is they're basically shifting the goalposts, right? The no true Scotsman fallacy shifts the goalpost by attacking the authenticity or purity of a person who appears to contradict a general statement. Okay, so maybe Angus is a Scotsman who doesn't like pink shirts, but he can't just like make a blanket statement and say that's true of every Scotsman. Now, if he did, that'd be a hasty generalization. But then he takes it a step further, which makes it no true Scotsman, not simply hasty generalization. Because then when something appears to the contrary of his hasty generalization, then he says, oh, well, then that person's not the real deal. That's where we get to the no true Scotsman fallacy. Example, Jack says that men don't eat quiche. Ron responds, "My wife makes the delicious quiche that I love eating for breakfast." Jack concludes that Ron is not a real man. And there's actually a phrase out there, you may have heard it, real men don't eat quiche. It's a joke. I mean, it's such a silly statement, but it does exist. It's an embodiment of the no true Scotsman fallacy. All right, pause, think of your own example, and then resume. Composition. In composition, an attribute of the parts is erroneously transferred to the whole. So, Maria likes anchovies. She also likes chocolate ice cream. Therefore, it is certain that she would like a chocolate sundae topped with anchovies. It doesn't make sense, right? You're assigning an attribute of the parts to the whole, and you can't do that. Each atom in this marker is invisible, or this teddy bear. Therefore, the marker, or this teddy bear, is invisible. No, that's plainly untrue. All right, so yeah, composition is pretty easy to spot, but can take more subtle forms. All right, so pause the video, think of your own example, and then resume. Division. In division, it's the opposite of the last one. An attribute of the whole is erroneously transferred to the parts. Salt is a non-poisonous compound, therefore its component elements are non-poisonous. Well, that is a very dangerous proposition, because if you ingest pure sodium and pure chlorine, you're probably going to be dead soon, or at least seriously sick. So division doesn't work. The jigsaw puzzle, when assembled, is circular in shape, therefore every piece must be circular. That's plainly ridiculous, right? Contradicts our common experience. But this would be a radical example of division. See if you can think of a more subtle example of division. Pause the video, do that, and then resume. Slippery slope, also known as the camel's nose. The arguer claims that a sort of chain reaction, usually ending in some dire consequence, will take place, but there's really not enough evidence for that assumption. The arguer asserts that if we take even one step onto the slippery slope, we will end up sliding all the way down to the bottom. He or she assumes that we can't stop halfway down the hill. All right, so I remember years ago there were these DirecTV ads that were nothing but slippery slopes, where one thing led to a ridiculous consequence, which in turn led to a ridiculous consequence. And those were funny, right? But there could be more subtle examples of slippery slope. Animal experimentation reduces our respect for life. If we don't respect life, we are likely to be more and more tolerant of violent acts like war and murder. Soon our society will become a battlefield in which everyone constantly fears for their lives. It will be the end of civilization. To prevent this terrible consequence, we should make animal experimentation illegal right now. Okay, this is clearly slippery slope, right? Because all those terrible things that the person mentioned don't necessarily come as a consequence from animal experimentation. Since animal experimentation has been legal for some time and civilization has not yet ended, it seems particularly clear that this chain of events won't necessarily take place. All right, pause the video, think of your own example of slippery slope, and resume when you've come up with one. All right, so now we're going to do a fun thing, which is, can you name the fallacy? All right, so for each one of these, okay, you got to think about what fallacy applies. It is ridiculous to have spent thousands of dollars to rescue those 2 whales trapped in the Arctic ice. Just look at all the people trapped in jobs they don't like. Is the government supposed to rescue them too? So pause the video, think of it, and then see if your answer is right when you resume. All right, did you get it? Red herring. Red herring because it's a big distraction, right? And it's a distraction. It sounds good, but it doesn't produce that conclusion. Not necessarily, anyway. This could be called weak analogy if it were stated differently. Whales trapped in ice are like people trapped in jobs. So you notice that one little word makes it a different fallacy. They both be fallacious. In one case, weak analogy. In another case, red herring, or even a combination of the two. But that one word like isn't here, and so it's a red herring. Can you name this fallacy? Plagiarism is deceitful because it is dishonest. Pause. Then think of it. Were you right? Begging the question. So you're just talking in a circle. Water fluoridation affects the brain. Citywide, students' test scores began to drop 5 months after fluoridation began. Pause. Think of it. Post hoc. You probably got that right. Okay. The fluoridation may be a cause, but the fact that it happened, before, 5 months before, doesn't prove anything. I know 3 redheads who have terrible tempers, and since Annabelle has red hair, I'll bet she has a terrible temper too. Pause, think, resume. Hasty generalization. Not the same as composition or division. Hasty generalization always has to do with a sample size that is too small. Composition or division do not. Okay, so that's the difference here. The fact that we're dealing with 3 redheads. Notice in the composition or division examples that we did, sample size has nothing to do with it. Attributing, secondary or the parts to the whole, or the whole of the parts, is a generalization or a general term that has nothing to do with sample size. Whereas this is the generalization that does have to do with a sample size of 3, which is too small. Compton is the dangerous part of Los Angeles where a large number of violent crimes happen. Therefore, every resident of Compton is a criminal. Obviously false. Pause, think, resume. Yeah, you probably got it. Division. Why should we put people on trial when we know they are guilty? Pause, think, resume. Begging the question. That's right. Yep, I used this one twice. But I used it twice to help you to learn how to recognize it. So this is an interesting one because it is a question itself. But notice that the question concludes a premise and a conclusion in reverse order, but that are basically saying the same thing. You support capital punishment just because you want an eye for an eye. But I have several good reasons to believe that capital punishment is fundamentally wrong. Pause, think of the answer, resume. Straw man, that's right. Set up a weak version, overstated, misrepresented of the argument, knock it down. The meteorologist predicted the wrong amount of rain for May. Obviously, the meteorologist is unreliable. Pause, think, resume. Hasty generalization. That's right, I used this one twice as well. Because you need to recognize that it's a small sample size. It's only 1 month. That's not enough data. You know Jillian Michaels' exercise videos must be worth the money. Look at the great shape she's in. Pause, think, resume. Post hoc. Yes, post hoc because she made those videos after she was already in really good shape. You can't assume that doing the videos is going to make you in good shape like she is. So it's post hoc. After is not necessarily cause. And in reverse order, say the fact that she's in great shape isn't directly the cause of the exercise videos being worth the money. We have to stop the tuition increase. The next thing you know, they'll be charging $40,000 a semester. All right, this is pretty short, but if you pause and think, I think you can get it. Slippery slope. Yeah, because we immediately jumped to this radical consequence that's probably not going to happen. And even though many steps in this slippery slope were left implied and not said, it's still slippery slope. The book Investing for Dummies really helped me understand my finances better. The book Chess for Dummies was written by the same author, published by the same press, and cost about the same amount. So it would probably help me understand my finances as well. Pause, think of the answer, and then resume. Weak analogy. Yeah, it's weak analogy. All right, and the reason it's weak analogy is because the subjects are so different. Okay, investing is so different from chess, and yes, they have the same author, same press and stuff, but the things that are similar in are secondary aspects. In what really matters, right, essential aspects. Investing is so radically different from chess that maybe something is common, but they're still different. That we can't make that analogy. Look, you are going to have to make up your mind. Either you decide that you can afford this stereo, or you decide you're going to do without music for a while. Pause the video, resume, and then see if you're right. False dichotomy. Yep, you probably got that. There are more than just those two options. I'm positive that my work will meet your requirements. I really need the job since my grandmother is sick. Pause, think, resume. Yep, appeal to pity, trying to make us feel sorry for him. Can you name this fallacy? Crimes of theft and robbery have been increasing at an alarming rate lately. The conclusion is obvious. We must reinstate the death penalty immediately. Pause, think, and resume. Yep, missing the point. The premise does not support that conclusion. It might support the conclusion of being tougher on crime or having more policemen or whatever it is, but not the death penalty for crimes of theft and robbery is disproportionate. I'm not a doctor, but I played one in the TV series New Amsterdam. You take it from me that when you need a fast-acting, effective, and safe painkiller, there is nothing better than Morphidope 2000. That is my considered medical opinion. Pause, think, and resume. Yep, I know that was an easy one. Appeal to authority. All right, so hopefully, hopefully these fallacies have helped you, or these examples have helped you to recognize fallacies. Um, and we're going to see throughout this course of apologetics how we're sometimes going to be able to spot these in fallacious arguments that are objections to the faith. All right, see you in class.